and welcome everyone to our fireside chat with a few people, a few experts. I'm the one who's the least knowledgeable among all of these people. So these people
come on,
industry experts. So I will. So let's do this. I think we will go ahead, go around and do a round of introductions. Who you are, what you do, and what brings you here. So Temur, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start off, and I will say for the record, I'm the least smartest person in this group. So Raja, I'll claim that one. No, hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Timur Rashid. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Redis. I've been at Redis for about 2.5 years. It's been a very, very exciting journey. We've been incubating the AI business, and that's my primary role, is incubating new businesses for the company and the technology. I say both because, the technology side of it is we have a very popular open source database called Redis, but at the same time, we also have a commercial business that we run as part of the company. And so our journey over these past 2.5 years has been incubating the AI business. We have a great team that has been taking the technology and then integrating it with the ecosystem, providing these really good examples for how to build AI-infused applications. And for us, we, like most companies, had a pivotal moment when ChatGPT launched, and the relevance, no pun intended, of our vector database technology became a lot more relevant as many developers and organizations were starting to build AI-based applications off of large language models. So really excited to be here and being joined with Daniel and Sam. And so I'll turn it over to Sam, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah. My name is Sam Partee. I help lead some of the applied AI work over at Redis. I'm the person you'll probably see on all the LangChain issues and Llama Index issues for Redis. And so if you see somebody rudely commenting on your review about how you should change things, that's probably me. Implemented quite a number of implementations for all types of different vector database use cases at this point. And you'll probably hear me talk a lot about them. Daniel?
Hey, everybody. I'm Daniel, CEO and founder, one of the two co-founders of Superlinked. What we have been working on for the last couple of years, and yes, we have been somewhat, misunderstood before people understood the importance of vector search. Also, thanks to the proliferation of ChatGPT, we've been looking at the problem of turning data into vector representations for a while now. And we have come to the domain from recommender systems, but now there are all kinds of other use cases that you can unlock by finding the right stuff and then feeding it to other models or directly to users. And yeah, we are looking at the compute side of that problem.
Okay, thanks Daniel, Temur, and Sam for the introduction. So what I'm going to do now is I will go around and maybe throw random questions at you. So Sam, the title of the webinar had this word RAG in it, right? So do you, our attendees at Data Science Dojo, many of them, they don't come with, like they are not hardcore technical people. So in the simplest words, can you explain what RAG is?
Sure, yeah. So this is actually something that I talk quite a bit about. It's really as simple as it sounds. You have retrieval, meaning you're retrieving something, right? Augmented, that's the A. Generation. And so the augment part is usually augmenting a prompt or some input to a model that will then generate something. So there's really 3 steps: retrieve, augment, generate. And that is what RAG does. Now, there's complex variants of this, but at the end of the day, most of the times when you're running a RAG pattern, it is because you're retrieving from something like a vector database like Redis, and then you're using that information and possibly metadata to then augment a prompt or some input to a model, usually a generative model. And then you're using that model to then say, if it's a Q&A system, answer a question. And so the full end-up prompt may be something like a question, the retrieved context, and then they ask to answer the question to that model. And so that really is the full cycle of a RAG pattern in very simplified terms.
So no fine tuning or pre-training then in that case?
No, actually. So this is in some ways the way I put it as the kind of two modalities of using these models is fine tuning on one side, and then stuffing everything into the prompt on another side. And then what I see as RAG is a modality that fits between them. So it doesn't always require something like, large context windows, and it doesn't always require something like fine tuning. But there are times and places for either of them. Okay. So it doesn't mean that you're doing RAG in place of fine tuning or in place of large context windows, but it is usually something that is a modality between them for, situations where especially some type of extraneous context is needed to either answer a question or guide a model to a specific answer set.
Okay, thanks, Sam. So Daniel, question for you, maybe on a lighter note, right? So when we had this post on this webinar, you posted this comment: vector database is all you need, right? So you don't need attention anymore. I mean, is it all vector databases? Okay, elaborate on this, right? So what were you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, well, the question is, what is the context that you need to answer a question, right? And this context can be assembled into the answering process in different ways, right? Like if we just take a step back and think from first principles, machine learning has always worked in a way where you get a bunch of data, you train a model, and then you run the model to answer a question, right? So all the information gets packed into the model itself, and then, it can understand kind of complex relationships. It can sort of do something that looks like reasoning, and it's all packed together into the model. And this, obviously works. The problem is that once the model gets very big, it gets hard to update, right? And so, if you want to build a knowledge base, kind of like a question answering system for your knowledge base, if every single company had to train that knowledge base into the model, this would be expensive, right? Of course, there is fine tuning, but with fine tuning, I think it works best for things where you want to, let's say, change the style of the answer, or maybe you want to fine tune for a specific language, so you want to kind of localize, or it's certain type of use case and you want certain format of the answer, right? Like those sort of structural tasks, I think fine tuning works well for. But if you want to train knowledge, sort of like random sort of bundle of knowledge into the model, first of all, it's expensive, and then secondly, you never quite know just what you trained in there, right? You never quite know what other inferences and connections the model will draw. And so, yeah, there are kind of like all these other considerations that, to me, it seems that the retrieval augmented generation is the pragmatic approach here, right? Where you put your engineering hat on, not necessarily the scientist one, and the engineer wants to kind of break things down to smaller parts, right? So I'll have my model that understands something about the domain in general, and then I'll have this contextual bit, which I'll keep intentionally separate because I can update it, I can shape it, and then I'll kind of bring the two together. And then that context is kind of what you need to answer the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
I'll build off that real quick, actually, if you don't mind. Yeah, so to build on some of those points, a lot of things like data safety come into play too with fine tuning. So like if you're building a model that you want to behave a certain way, like Daniel was saying, it might respond in a certain way with certain diction. That might be a fine tuning task, or even like a few shot example task. But if you have something where you want to use the same model for, like, let's say, an internal and external service, right? Then how are you sure that if you fine tune that model on that data set, that you're not going to expose something that should only be exposed to internal users? And so, like you're saying, instead, you can then segment or use something like RBAC or, with the traditional vector data to say, oh no, these users only have access to these data, these, specific hashes or whatever, if you're using Redis. And then you can retrieve just those or only search over that space when you're doing the RAG pattern for that specific application, which enables a much faster way to go about creating multiple versions of the same app, at least that it's in a data safe way. The other part of that is updating. Fine tuning is kind of slow. And so if you have an app, like I used the example recently in a talk of like a warehouse with sensors, and those readouts, like, okay, what machine is the most likely to fail right now? Say that's your query. And it has to read over all of the metrics. Well, those metrics can't be stale. And so you can't be fine tuning. It wouldn't make sense, right? So in that case, it makes much more sense to be storing in a durable database that has vector search capability so that you can then search and retrieve those metrics that are updated in real time and not stale. And so that was the additional, layer I'd put on top there.
Yeah, great. So Sam and Daniel, I will come back to you with some more questions around this. So let's turn to Temur. So Temur, you have led business teams at Azure, AWS, and now Redis. So tell us, how do you use RAG to, riches, right? So, how do you use RAG to go to riches, right? So, I mean, what is really, why is it suddenly there's so much buzz around vector databases? You and I mean, we have talked about vector databases quite a bit, and suddenly there has been this explosion around, right? So everyone is talking about vector databases, right? So, and some people like Daniel, they think that's all you need, right? So tell us, where do you see in general the technology, and from your expertise on the business side, where do you see all of this heading?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think the way to look at it, in every sort of technology cycle where you have some emerging technology, either introducing new use cases or new opportunities, from a business standpoint, it's always is like, how do we look at technology to enable business, right? And so what are those business problems that we're trying to use technology to go solve, right? And I think why vector databases in particular have had this moment is, now that you have this disruptive technology of large language models, and more importantly, I think the access to large language models, it always introduces, it always, well, like Jeffrey Moore says that, these disruptive technologies, what they do is they unlock trapped value, right? And so what's really happened here is you've had a value creation moment with large language models, but at the same time, when new value gets, unlocked, what happens is there are various challenges, and that presents an opportunity for either existing architectures to go solve, or newer and refined architectures to go solve as well too. And so to really answer your question, I think from a business standpoint, when we look at all of this stuff around RAG, and I always sort of give my dad jokes, which is from rag to riches, or RAG is all the rage. And people laugh at me for that, but it's actually really true, because what it's ultimately solving from a business standpoint, and why business decision makers are actually more receptive to vector databases, is it ultimately future-proofs the overall architecture and the business around the large language model stack. But what it also does, it also gives a level of durability. And let me really paint that across three things, right? At the end of the day, when you look at large language models, they're really doing kind of general purpose generation of content, right? But companies really want to bring their own context into the responses that are being generated, which is why vector databases and RAG play an important role, because now you can combine general purpose generation with contextual generation, right? And whether that's taking the form of an industry specific kind of knowledge base, vector databases really help with that process. And therefore, the RAG architecture facilitates that even more. So number one, it brings domain context in. Number two, it addresses this level of security concerns, right? And so where you have proprietary data and you want to kind of put tight guardrails around it, this architecture and vector databases allow you to do that, because now your proprietary data doesn't necessarily have to go into something that is generally available, like those large language models. And then thirdly, I think, as you think about context and guardrailing it, right, the other aspect which is very, very important is accuracy of generation, right? So the accuracy of the content that's being generated, this is where RAG can help facilitate that, particularly when either you don't want to fine tune a model, or you don't want to go through the expensive process of actually creating a brand new model and training from scratch.
Thanks, Timur. So Daniel, going back to you. So the way I look at RAG is, it almost looks like that you are reducing a problem that is more of an AI problem to a data engineering problem, right? So, the foundation model becomes a black box, and you're basically putting, some moving parts, some APIs here and there, you're combining everything, and then you're achieving the goals, right? So, and then also, the security issues are also there, and then knowledge update also, it's easier in the sense that, the new knowledge goes to the vector database as opposed to, needing the fine tuning. So how do you see it first? And then perhaps maybe Daniel, you and Sam, and maybe Timur as well, right? So do you see any challenges on the technical side and also on the business model side, right? So how do you see this in terms of challenges? And first, of course, do you agree with my characterization, or do you have anything to add here?
Let me brag on Daniel and Superlinked for a little bit, and then he can go. Like when you said, it opens up new business verticals. It opens up the ability also for people who are experienced in these areas to apply their technical knowledge into a subset of the domain. And that's what Daniel's really made it Superlinked as a platform where he's included a lot of really state-of-the-art techniques into a space where a lot of people currently don't have a lot of experience. And, it's essentially like hand-holding people to the state of the art. And so I think, people like Daniel are at the forefront of doing that. And that's what makes it a really interesting platform. So there you go, Daniel. That's your one for the day. And now I'm going to be mean the rest of the day. Okay.
Thank you, Sam. It's good to see the good side as well. Yeah, I think, look, in general, one of the problems I think of the sort of machine learning community is the fragmentation, right? There are certain problems that get solved in every single vertical separately, right? And one of those problems is information retrieval. When you do fingerprinting and matching in video analytics, when you do recommender systems, when you do RAG, it's like you are always trying to represent your data in a way that sort of captures the relationship between these different data points, and then you can build on top of this, right? Let's say relevant retrieval, or finding a person that looks like, finding a face that looks like a certain person. And if you talk to the top experts in each of those fields, they all work on kind of the same problems, and they go to their own sort of events. But at the same time, they are working on kind of the same stuff, right? And I think there is a big opportunity for a lot of the reasons, proliferations of vector databases, the availability of models. We can really kind of aggregate a lot of this expertise, basically, right? And kind of solve information retrieval once and for all, right? Air quotes, but kind of it's true. And so I think there is a big opportunity to transfer knowledge from recommender systems to RAG, for example, right? Because, in recommender systems, people have been turning data into vectors for like decades, basically, right?
Literally, yeah, decades.
And it's really kind of a sophisticated way to think about, okay, how do I establish feedback loops, right? This is like, feedback loops is the key to everything, because you asked about the business case. So why does it make sense to run these systems? Well, you want to achieve some sort of goal, and you want to sell more stuff in your e-commerce shop, or you want to, get the user an answer to a question which they'll be happy about, and they'll run with it, they'll accept it, right? And so the recommender engine people, they always bring this thought of, okay, how are we capturing this feedback, implicit, explicit, and feeding it back into the model, feeding it back into the system that creates those vectors in the first place, so that we get better over time, right? And like a lot of this stuff has been thought through before, and now it's about kind of applying those thoughts to RAG and the emerging areas, basically.
And I'd actually have to second that, if I may, Raja. Daniel hit on a point that most people don't think about, and it actually does dovetail into the business model, right? Which is this feedback loop. The data feedback loop is just so critical as part of the overall architecture. And to some extent, Daniel and Sam, you guys keep me honest here, this is where RLHF comes into play too as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so not only do you have this data feedback loop, but then you also have the human elements in it as well too.
What's cool about what Superlink's doing also, the second one, I swear it's the last one, but it's that they can also manipulate vectors for you. So it's not just model reinforcement learning through human feedback. You can also do it through embeddings and how you do that, and how you approach those things, and vector manipulation and keeping those things together. Also a really interesting way to do it. One more point about, how people the pickaxe analogy, like sell the pickaxes. If there's a gold rush, don't be a gold miner. There's one thing that people never mention. That analogy is another subset of people that made a ton of land, but there weren't very many of them, and it's the landowners. They didn't mine gold. They didn't even most of the time have gold on their land. Well, in this age, is data. And anybody who holds the most data, or at least collects the most data through reinforcement learning and human feedback, is going to be essentially or at least if they use it correctly, because that's one of the most valuable things right now. And people are even looking for better ways to collect that data through these types of interfaces. It's really interesting is that we're on pace. I saw a survey the other day. We're on pace to run out of really good curated textual data in the next few years in terms of what we can actually obtain from common sources, like, for instance, Common Crawl or one of these other ones, right? Well, what happens then? What happens then is that people try to gather it, almost like through the, Turking style of people just interacting with their application, which, to Daniel's point, is something that people have been doing in recommendation systems with two-tower models for ages. And so I think his point about kind of combining the insights of these fields is golden, because you're just like, taking things that are already proven and applying them. It always shocks me when people are like, vector databases are a part of recommendation systems. And I'm like, that's where they started. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, Timur, you wanted to add something, so you want to go ahead, or
No. I was just acknowledging Sam's comment.
Okay. So Daniel, Sam, I love it, right? So you're telling us all the good things about it, right? So tell us some gory details from the trenches, right? So I have been helping my team. I don't do a lot of hands-on work, but I help the team, and so I'm aware of some of the issues that can be problematic, right? So just anything from your experience?
A lot. Daniel, you want to go? You're on me to go.
No, I think you can start. I think you have seen like the broader range of issues.
So we work with we have a lot of customers, and we have a lot of just users and open source frames that we commit to. And one of the things right now that I think people are overlooking, one of the things that I see the most is taking an open source framework and just putting it in a prod and expecting it to work. And a lot of that is just like head scratching, because there's not been a minor release yet. And it's not like these frameworks aren't great. They are great, and they will be even better soon. But when something's not even a year old, let alone the implementation being less than a year old, and it's probably weeks old, it's not necessarily the safest thing to put it in a prod. And I think some people are really rushing things right now because they can see in these POCs that they can turn around in 2 weeks, which, by the way, that's never been something that's really happened before. No one's pumping out POCs in 2 weeks like we have with this whole kind of new wave of usage. But now, because it's actually so easy to derive really interesting applications from this tech stack, people are, I think, rushing in a lot of ways. And so I see a lot of that. It honestly just worries me a little bit of things like security, when people are using, databases that have been out there for a year or something like that. And then they're switching over and they're like, yeah, we're going to migrate to an enterprise database now. And you see what they were doing before. And you're like, wait a minute, this was in prod? Like users used this? It's, it's a little scary. So that's a gory detail for you. Daniel?
Okay. I have a flip side of this actually, because you kind of mentioned that it's possible to do a POC in 2 weeks. And also because of like zero-shot learning, we don't have this kind of, we are not anymore locked into this 6-month data science project where you load the data, you play with it in a Python notebook for a super long time, and then the budget runs out before you actually launch anything, right? So we have kind of the lead time to launch something is now super quick, right? And then the problem is, okay, so you can test it with some percentage of users, you can do some demos, but what does it take to actually roll these things out at scale, right? And that's where questions around, we discussed security already. There are questions of efficiency, right? So how much is this going to cost if we roll it out to 100 million users, I think a cool stat on that front is that already in 2020, I think Google.com search was doing 10% of queries on vector search, basically. And like that's like double digit, right? I mean, it's a lot of queries, basically. And that's just the retrieval, right? Then you kind of add the generative step to it, and the price goes crazy, latency goes crazy, right? So I think the problem has been sort of pushed to later stages of the project, right? Where before you had to do a lot of kind of politics and setup to get that 6-month, 9-month kind of support into the project, right? And then you had time to kind of line up the next things, and there was kind of natural cadence to these things. Now it's super quick to do the initial POC, and then people think, okay, we just like tune it a little bit or whatever, and then we launch it, right? And I think this is kind of underappreciated. What it takes to realize that, okay, so we started to do the retrieval based on semantic embeddings, and that's to Raja's point, okay, we can treat this as a black box, we have some models, we make some vectors, we generate text, right? And then the last 10% of the queries, you notice, okay, these are just super weird answers, right? And it's not like keyword search where, okay, let's just like block some keywords and it's gonna work, right? This is just kind of, you open a Pandora's box of, oh, wait a minute, this can just backfire in many different ways. So, and then come the feedback loops, right? Okay, so let's get user feedback. Let's flag it internally, externally. Let's use the behavior or how people react to these things to kind of make better vectors and make better retrieval and sort of like fine-tune the model maybe. And I think that's, if you do it wrong or if you kind of discover from scratch, that can be years, right? You are almost like dipping into fundamental research, God forbid, which is much more difficult than the data science project you had before, right? So somehow I think the industry has done a good job at the time to demo being weeks now. But I think we have to figure out the kind of time to production not being, okay, now you have a $10 million research project on your hands, right?
Yeah.
So thank Daniel and Sam. So Timur, coming back to you. So I've long held this belief. I mean, I've been in industry for quite some time now. So I one of my personal pain points is with I would not say just the early stage or early career data scientist, but most technologists is that once they have a hammer in their hand, right? So they start looking for nails. I mean, they start hammering everything, right? So tell us, first of all, I mean, this is, adoption of, call it analytics, call it generative AI. It's more of a culture and business problem first, then you go to technology, right? So how do you prioritize, let's say in the context of RAG, how do you prioritize over other options that are available? And what should the businesses be most excited about, worried about, cautious about, just put any adjective in this category? So can you give us an idea, how should we decide?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's one of those things where you sort of have to sift through the noise, right? And then what I like to say, I always go back to first principles, right? And so look, there's no doubt that, this application called ChatGPT immediately just showed the power of generative AI, right? And so now you have people that, couldn't spell AI all of a sudden being, the biggest users of ChatGPT because it became so relevant. It made it so easy that the conversational aspects of this, whatever ChatGPT was doing, just gave them immediate value. So on one hand, you have this thing where consumers are just now enamored and just they're looking at this and they're very overwhelmed with what AI can do for them. But then when you look at the flip side, like building these things are not easy, right? And it goes back to all these complex things that Daniel and Sam have talked about, architectural considerations, data literacy, and all those kind of things. So to really kind of answer your question, I look at it as always going back to first principles, right? And so at the end of the day, whether we talk about RAG, whether we talk about vector databases, human feedback, hallucinations, and all these things that are very relevant right now, data literacy is so important, right? So I almost say that don't forget about data quality and all the hygiene that goes into building very streamlined data pipelines, feature pipelines, and those kinds of things, right? Because we can't forget about those foundational things, right? I think those are going to be very, very important. But at the same time, I also look at it this way too. I was talking to a CIO the other day, and he said, look, at what you're selling me is a bunch of Lego blocks all duct taped together, right? And so there's so much fragmentation with the number of tools and frameworks that are available. And on one hand, I love that because it's almost like this gold rush and this moment of the Cambrian explosion of AI happening before our eyes. But then at the same time, for people that really want structured ways of looking at, well, how do I procure a technology or a set of technologies in my company? It's a lot of vendor fatigue right now, right? And so it's like, hey, do I pick this database? Do I do that database? Do I use my existing investments? So while data literacy is the first point I really want to say is foundational, and you can't lose that no matter what emerging hype cycle we're in right now. The other aspect is always asking, what are the jobs to be done, right? And when you look at what are the jobs to be done, that'll give you a first principles way of saying, well, what tools and skill sets do people need to have, right? And I always think that's always foundational to say, because there was a time where it was all about the data engineer, right? And then it was all about the data scientist. And those are actually very viable, kind of roles. But in this space that we're in right now, the ground is shifting before our feet more than we'd like, right? And so it's always good to go back to what are the jobs to be done, therefore what are the tools that we need to enable those business outcomes that people are looking for.
Okay. Thank
you.
Can
I have a question for Sam? And I guess the timer as well. So I'm
Daniel,
curious.
Settling some score from the past, or please go ahead. Yes.
We just talk a lot. I'm actually curious in your experience in sort of bringing the idea of vector retrieval into companies. I think there are maybe broadly two ways to anchor the value for that, and I'm just curious which way it falls. I think there is one way is to say this technology helps you sell more stuff. If you're an e-commerce company, right, you can build this into your recommender engine or other sort of pieces of your ML stack, and then the performance will increase because XYZ, right? So this is some sort of opportunity, some sort of revenue growing initiative, right? And then maybe this is how it starts when it's new, right? It's like, okay, you wanna, it's risky, but we can, you can make 5% more revenue, so let's make a bet, right? And then as people maybe realize over time, okay, this is kind of starting to be an established piece of technology, right? That we kind of have as a part of our core strategy. We need, a vector retrieval system, and then we start to maybe have an argument about efficiency, features, enablement of the internal talent, right? I don't know, maybe we can draw some sort of parallel in like data warehouses, right? Initially, they were pitched to maybe like unlock some sort of specific business value, but then over time, you don't really anymore argue, hey, should we have a data warehouse? And it's more, which one is more integrated, which one has the features we need, which one has the ecosystem around it, right? So I'm just wondering where in that life cycle we are with vector retrieval.
I mean, well, it depends on the context, right? So if it's a recommendation system, the ROI argument is always really strong, right? Mm-hmm. Because you can go into any shop and be like, I just, obviously I'm working at Redis, so I'm going to say it from the Redis perspective and be like, we are the fastest. Our query latency is super low. And you can also store your features in it as an online feature store. You can chain the calls and you can do your, 2-tower exchange and get your item embeddings and then, find the metadata of those item embeddings in one call. And that's really fast. And when people reduce the time to suggestion or time to recommendation, that increase ROI. That's like a well-established fact in general. And so that's a really easy one. Now, with these newer LLM use cases, what I've primarily seen is productivity is the biggest one. So lots of situations today where someone's using BM25 or some type of search, which honestly, most of the time it could just be implemented better and it would be fine. But they're taking that and they're turning those search systems, especially internal search systems, into something that is either simply just using semantic search instead of BM25, or then using semantic search and a generative model in a RAG-based pattern. And that when people, it's like time to insight is what I would call the measurement. It like think customer call center, person has a question. Oh, well, I don't know about that product. Call center person, basically asks their private chat GPT. And the metric there is how many more calls can my call center make because they now have this app that we're hosting internally for our people, or how many more people can our financial analysts serve with this private ChatGPT documentation, or those time to something where it's like a productivity measurement seem to be some of the biggest ones right now, especially for the RAG-based pattern. But it's not as strict as something like I'd say, recommendation systems where you can walk in anywhere and be like, yeah, you want to make more money? Do it. That's a little bit easier of an argument, I'd say. But given how much better the productivity increases are, I'm putting it in air quotes because, sometimes people just do it to do it. But sometimes they are really, really powerful. And the insights that are gleaned from it. We had one recently where the people actually using the product internally at the company were like, honestly, it doesn't even matter when it doesn't retrieve context. It's guesses. Give me more information. It's bounded guesses about the company. Give me more information than, if I was just to search around. And, that alone is super powerful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that immediately raises some red flags of they'll get one piece of it wrong and run with it, right? This is kind of misinformation.
Oh, like I said, people are rushing to prod. It's a thing. They are rushing to prod. And look, some people are, some people aren't. But you're right. The red flags that are raised there can be a little concerning at times.
Yeah, but the gains kind of are sufficiently big for us to then figure out how to make it work, basically.
Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Well, then I think also to build on that, the interesting thing about it is how all this stuff ultimately drives either top line or bottom line metrics, right? And so I always give this analogy that, with all this technology that we have, you can almost give an existing product a new brand, right? And so when I look at what Microsoft's done with Bing, not many people really cared about Bing until now you infuse, generative AI in there. And so now it just got a brand uplift in a way, right? Yeah. And, Copilot, you look at GitHub Copilot, it's just all about driving productivity. You look at what are the financial services firms are doing with enabling conversational AI assisted tools for, wealth managers, for example, right? So, productivity, growth, new user experiences, I think all those things that we've talked about as, higher level business outcomes are actually now being realized because generative AI is just now being infused in all those products, right?
Yeah, okay. And I wish we can start A/B testing these things, right? Because that's kind of where, it kind of goes back to engineering. So that's why we, for example, like to get in through the recommender engine stuff, right? Because that can be A/B tested. That's sort of hard numbers, and a lot of the generative use cases are completely new, right? So that's there is no sort of baseline for the company. It's very hard to predict the revenue impact. So, using some of these technologies to improve the existing UX while experimenting with the new UX, I think that's also a way to get buy-in, move a needle on something that you already know contributes to bottom line, and then have this parallel project of figuring out new modalities for users to interact with your product. I think that's also another way to reduce risk for the practitioners, right? So you are the data scientist sitting there at your company. Should you shoot straight away for ChatGPT for X, or are there small wins that you can very quickly A/B test into the system? Hey, let's just generate different product descriptions and show that they convert better. It's like a no-brainer, right? And then you can kind of layer. Then you have practiced what does it take to run the language model in production in a way that doesn't kill my system. And it shows value faster because it's better defined. And then kind of go sideways from there and add more modalities and UX. I think that also makes sense.
Yeah.
So Timur, you remarked about Bing, right? So I worked for Bing for like good 5-6 years. So I may not necessarily agree with you, but I think these curve jumping technologies, revolutionary technologies like large language models. So these are more of a marketing problem than a technology problem fundamentally, right? So so if you look at it, right? So all of these models, they have their pros and cons, but at the end of the day, how you integrate them in your product and how you actually get that mind share out there, I think that is what matters, right? So I think if you look at it, Google probably messed up in this, right? So no one has any doubts that their technology is not as good, but I think it is not the technology side, but perhaps the marketing side where they did not do a great job, right? So, that's a different debate, maybe one-on-one later. So
I'm actually curious on that front. I think there is a smooth line, and I've been at Google for a bunch of years, so I think there is a line between marketing and then the underlying infrastructure, right? It's like a smooth scale, basically. And for example, product is somewhere on that scale, right? So we are kind of like building the foundation. We are delivering the value to the user when they use the product, right? So like, what is it actually doing? And then do people have awareness? Do they understand what it is? That's kind of more on the marketing front, right? And I think some of these companies are really good at the infra, but not necessarily so good at the product, right? So I would sort of like stretch it out from marketing and pull it all the way to product, which is as some of these tools, and Sam mentioned, okay, they're very early, the tooling is early. But I think what really makes or breaks this whole exercise is, can people build useful stuff with our tools, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that takes understanding the user, understanding your domain, being creative enough to throw away the old UX eventually and really try something new. But then also, are the tools making you want to rip your hair out, or it's a sort of a decent experience, right?
And being bold too, because I do think that Google, especially Google Research, has had, state-of-the-art AI for a very, very long time. Like, I think it's a very safe assumption. I mean, you just go look at some of their GitHub repos, it's not that hard to find, or read their papers. Like, I've been reading Google Brain and research papers for an incredibly long time that are state of the art, but it also takes being bold and saying, no, we're going to put this out there. And, younger companies like OpenAI, it's a little easier, right? You don't have the world's best ad auction marketplace of all time, right? You can survive just putting out something that may, if you're OpenAI, you can putting out something that maybe needs some tweaks or some updates, right? Whereas I think that's a lot harder for someone like a Google. And so I think it's important to remember, it's also like I think the analogy of where it fits is very good. But once you have it, it just takes that, okay, now I have to be bold and put it out there. And sometimes that's really hard to do if you're really established.
Google had a lot more to lose than OpenAI if it came, if they came out, and it actually ended up being that case, right? So yeah, so we have actually 21. So please, Timur, we have 21 questions, and I was just
gonna say one comment. It's interesting though, because like I look at it through two access points. One access point is first mover advantage, right? You look at AWS when they started cloud, clearly first mover advantage, right? But then there's another thing of mind share grab, right? And so what's happened, like if you look at OpenAI, and again, this is one man's opinion, this is my perspective on it. You know, OpenAI had this first mover advantage with ChatGPT, right? But I think Microsoft did an amazing job with mind share capture by infusing that one thing into all their products, right? And so when you think of Copilot, you think of GitHub, right? And so I think it's this access point of first mover advantage, you know, obviously moving very, very fast, right? But then at the same time, how quickly you can capture the mind share. And I think Microsoft's done an amazing job with capturing generative AI mind share in this space right now, even though you can make an argument that first mover advantage with SageMaker was there many years before, right?
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so this is great. So thanks for the discussion here. I'm going to actually pick a few questions. Let's see how many we can finish, right? So
maybe we can do like rapid fire to really get through it.
I was about to say, there's some that I can just, you know, blitz off if we want to do that. I don't know.
Yeah, let's see how many we can get, right? So so I like this question here by Yashwant. Like overfitting is the biggest challenge implementing ML. If you have to pick the top challenge in LLMs, what would that be? And any of you?
Yeah, well, first is I don't know if overfitting is definitely the biggest challenge. I think we have a lot of tools to mitigate that now. I'd say, you know, doing something accurate and proud over a very long time is probably still the hardest challenge, and, you know, dealing with drift and things like that, because putting models in prod is really hard. But I mean, top challenge in LLMs is still great data, you know, great input. It's always data. You know, I think the models are fine. I think, you know, defining a great system and having great data are probably my biggest two. I don't know, Daniel.
Okay. I would say kind of control. So I think about it as babysitting, like LLM, like you know, GPT-5. It's kind of in some ways like a baby, and you have to, you know, like micromanage.
At least a 5-year-old.
Is that a year count? No, I think you basically have to micromanage the inputs, the outputs, the sort of how people react to their interactions with the model. You have to, you know, data observability has been around for a while. And now, you know, there is a reason that the LangChain guys launched the observability product as the sort of next product, is because, yeah, we have this sort of very general, overgeneral probably tool for all kinds of tasks, and yeah, the control. And I don't mean control in the sense of like AGI, you know, coming after us. I mean just how do we get it to solve the job to be done, basically, in a way that doesn't create all kinds of collateral damage for users and so on.
Okay, this is great. So Daniel, you mentioned observability. So we have actually another webinar, one-on-one chat with Alicia Wisniewicz from YLabs, and she is going to be talking about observability in LLMs. So tomorrow, same time. So this is for other folks who may be out there. Okay, so this is a very common question, right? So you know, all the hype, right? So AI, Chat GPT, everything, right? So when enterprises, they decide that they need to use it, well, no, we cannot use this thing, right? So how do you handle these queries, or how do you handle these concerns, or you don't? I mean, just tell me. I mean,
so just to clarify that question, is that like, you know, when companies are evaluating if they want to do this or not, how do you kind of say that they should and like, give them assurance that it'll work or?
Yeah,
okay.
I think both, right? So I think it's perhaps the organization is convinced that this is going to work, but they have concerns around, data privacy, security, and all of that, right? So,
well, I'll go really quickly, but I think Timur is also really suited to handle this. Is honestly, most of the big enterprises that we deploy these workloads with, they really care nothing about which model or the chunking strategy. They're going to figure all that out later. The things that they want to know first is, do you have RBAC? Do you have this type of deployment? Are you in this cloud? Do you have an on-prem? Can they share the same VPC? Do you have a Kubernetes operator for your Kubernetes deployment? Those kinds of things, they seem to care way, way more about. And that's really at the top tier kind of enterprises. But that having that as Redis makes life really easy. But typically having those things is what puts them at ease and saying, yes, we do have TLS. Yes, every retrieval is encoded. Yes, all of that. They can be assured their data safe end to end. And then on the last side is using things like guardrails, being able to work on the prompt with a customer, trying to say, hey, look, this is what you should include when there's no context. Having it safeguarded, passing it through other APIs to detect for basically incorrectness or foul language or things like that. But those things usually put them at ease a little bit more from a technical perspective. But Timur, I know you're going to start talking now.
Yeah, and I was just going to say real quickly, because I know we have to get to other questions, is that I think this is where you really have to engage legal counsel within your company. We did this at Redis too. We had a mandate that, look, if we want to drive productivity using Gen AI tools across the board, product development, sales, marketing, legal, support, etc. And so we work with legal counsel to come up with Gen AI policies and guidelines, right? And so it's like, well, how are we going to treat PII data? How are we going to treat situations where we have confidential data? The tools that we use, we have to make sure that they have the right guardrailing so that we can either decide to use them or not use them at all, right?
Okay. Thank you, Timur. So there's a few questions around this, right? So I will summarize them and collapse them into a single question. So there are questions around the privacy and security. So when you're using RAG, so the data is still in your own vector database, but you're still making calls to OpenAI, assuming that you're using one of the OpenAI models. So how can you ensure the security and safety of data in a RAG setting? What are some of the ways?
I have a couple, I can show slides on this, but I guess we probably don't have time for that. If there's a couple different setups that you can use to make it completely data safe, which is on-prem, you run your models on-prem, like hook up NVIDIA Triton, and then you have something like Redis Enterprise on-premise. And then you literally can stay within your own server before things ever leave the server. The other options include things like running it all on Azure. So Azure OpenAI, Azure LLMs, Azure Azure Cache for Redis Enterprise. Those, then it never leaves Azure. There's also equivalents on AWS and things like that. So that is one way.
Okay. This is good. So there is one more question directed at Daniel here. What type of customers and use cases does Superlink have?
Yeah, so we started, I was talking about this idea that information retrieval is kind of similar across different verticals. So we started broad. We started in social marketplaces and e-commerce. But I can also tell you that the biggest contracts come from places where the bottom line sort of lift is the easiest to attribute, and that's e-commerce, right? So kind of through the lens of, hey, let's measure increase of sales. That's where that's where the contracts can get to kind of six figures, at least for us, right? And then you have like the platform teams at much bigger companies that are figuring out the data strategy for the next year, then that's like a whole another ball game, basically. But yeah, I would say e-commerce is the main driver. Actually, there is one question that I kind of liked, and I thought it's a little bit different, and I think it's relevant. And somebody asked about Kafka, like data streaming. How is data streaming related to all this, right? And I think that touches on this broader point of what are all these data points that we convert to vectors to then drive the retrieval, right? There is going to be some real-time data, some user clicks, some change data. Oh, this product is no longer available, right? All this context might be streaming in. You are obviously ingesting in batch as well. So you need a plan for this, right? And with the, with RAG, you can have a plan. That's the beauty of it, right? Because you are doing some of these operations on top of just the vectors. So you might be not even running the inference. When a click comes in, you might be, let's say, calculating an embedding of a graph of interaction between buyers and products, right? And there is like a new edge in that graph, and you are calculating an embedding for that product, right? To kind of keep it next to relevant products to then feed that into the upstream model that you're using to answer questions about products, or you are surfacing them through a recommendation, right? So yeah, I think the right way to think about this is to look at work back from the problem. Okay, we want to, let's say, answer questions better, and then work backwards. Okay, what does better mean? Where are we getting the feedback? What does relevance mean? Where are we getting that? Hook up the right data sources. Some of it is streaming, some of it is batch, some of it is graph data, some of it is just like timestamps or popularity counters. Some of it is text, that's where the LLMs come in, and just kind of really make a map of the whole. This is why like Unity catalog in Databricks is useful, right? Like not sponsored plug, but like map out all your inputs and then figure out, okay, how are we feeding this into the whole system and what's going on? Yeah, I think that's important.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. We are out of time. It's right, we're right at the hour boundary. Sam and Daniel, do you see any other question that you would like to pick up from here, or should we?
One thing I'll say is that I dropped my LinkedIn profile into chat, and I'm super happy to sort of like answer questions in a follow-up as well. If people want to connect, shoot over a question, always happy to answer, because we definitely won't get to everything. Actually, I'll put it there once again because I see that it sort of floated up.
Yes, and please send these guys. These are cool guys, very friendly guys. I can vouch for them being very friendly. So reach out to them if you need any help. But unfortunately, we cannot actually go through all the questions because
and one more thing is if you I think it's Satish. If you connect with me, you have a very specific question about LangChain, context buffer memory, and consistency and whatnot. Happy to try and answer that for you. Just friend me on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever you want, and ask me that question there. I'll help you out.
That sounds good. Any closing thoughts, anyone?
No, it's exciting times, a lot to learn. Just keep yourself close to always be learning, right? So
yeah, and like build things, let's not
build.
Yeah.
Yes,
we
build.
need to just kind of learning by doing. This is my motto.
So I'm glad you bring this up, Daniel, because sometimes people go on this never-ending journey of attending courses that won't take you anywhere, right? So you will probably know things in theory, but a lot of things, what I call the gory details from trenches, right? So when those lessons cannot be learned until you actually start building things. If you're not involved.
One thing I love to say is, sorry to cut you off. All of those books or courses were written by people who learned by building. All of them.
Exactly. At least the good ones.
They wouldn't know enough for it to be a good book if they didn't learn by building. You have to build it to know it.
As a matter of fact, with the upcoming bootcamp, Sam, you will be there next week, right? So the bootcamp actually resulted from delivering, close to a year of delivering projects, delivering solutions for customers, and said it is non-trivial enough that we actually launch a bootcamp, and we are very excited about that bootcamp. Many of the questions, someone asked this question about how do you make vector data from books. So we will talk about that. LangChain question. We have a module on LangChain. So a lot of interesting things happening. So keep building. I think that would be the best advice. I mean, we should trademark it, right? This thing, right?